A 6-week abortion ban is basically a full abortion ban. States have banned access to abortion pills. This is putting women in precarious positions, all people who can be pregnant in precarious positions. And so we're just watching this nightmare take place. I think there is a very scary future that we could imagine, a future in which there is almost a full restriction on abortion access.
Israel has announced its most massive expansion of settlements in the West Bank. While this horror show, this genocide has been happening in Gaza, in the West Bank, you have had more than 500 Palestinians killed in the past 8 months. You've had settlers become more extreme and more violent, kill Palestinians, injure Palestinians without any accountability whatsoever. Biden has been terrible on Palestine. And Trump will be even worse.
Welcome to episode 210 of the Refuse Fascism podcast, a podcast brought to you by volunteers with Refuse Fascism. I'm Sam Goldman, one of those volunteers and host of the show. Refuse Fascism exposes, analyzes, and stands against the very real danger and threat of fascism coming to power in the United States. As we were initially about to record this on Saturday evening, shots were fired at a Trump rally in Western Pennsylvania. As we are recording early Sunday morning, the facts that we know are that Trump was grazed, but fine. 2 people at the scene were killed, including the shooter, and 2 injured. A young, white, registered Republican man was identified as the shooter. In the immediate aftermath, the MAGA fascist movement did not miss a beat in using the shooting to advance fascist bloodlust, with MAGA media, influencers, and those in the halls of power, including Representative Mike Collins, Representative Lauren Boebert, and Senator and top contender for Trump VP, J.D. Vance, blaming Biden for the shooting. Their movement is not grief-stricken, nor is it demoralized. They are foaming at the mouth. They are chomping at the bit. For the time being, we highly recommend the Breaking News Consumer Handbook from On the Media, Project WNYC, which is in the show notes, and can be found at onthemedia.org, and our multitude of episodes on fascist lies, disinformation, and myth-making, which will all be on full display in the coming days, regardless of any facts on the ground. Also, highly recommend checking out our multitude of episodes on Christian fascism. As the need for further comment arises, you know where to find us. With that, let's dive in. In today's episode, we're sharing 2 interviews. First, a conversation with Aziza Ahmed to discuss this Supreme Court's terms abortion-related rulings. And then we welcome Wajahat Ali back on to discuss the genocide in Gaza. Thanks to those who already got their Refuse Fascism t-shirts. We can't wait to see them out in the world. So be sure to post pics on the socials and tag us at Refuse Fascism. With your purchase, you can spread the prerogative and start the urgent conversations we need now and build this community. Plus, you keep this show, this resource available. So after listening, check the show notes for the link and go buy some shirts, please. Patrons, there's a discount code posted on our Patreon page, so be sure to check that out. Before the interview, some developments as they relate to the Republi-fascist threat from just this past week. This week, you can't turn on the news without hearing some opinion on should Biden stay in the race or not? Will he stay in the race or not? Is he mentally fit? You got some people saying he's the only chance we have against fascism, and others saying the stakes are so high that we need a more viable Democratic candidate. Both sides treating the recent events in France as a Rorschach test, taking whatever skewed lessons they think serves their argument. But let's step back some. Where are we in 2024? We are facing a raging fascist movement here, promising to take power by any means possible, already delegitimizing the 2024 elections, saying any loss is fraudulent. We've got growing fascist power and influence the world over. We've got an environmental crisis that threatens all of humanity. We're watching a live stream genocide, killing tens of thousands with the potential to very quickly become hundreds of thousands. Why the fuck are we treating this situation like some dating reality show, desperate to find out who's going to get to the next round, who America's going to pick to take home? This is a cascading crisis that's going to shape history. The question isn't who we root for in this horse race. It's what are we, all of us, gonna do? What will actually defeat fascism? Because despite delusional fascist claims, Joe Biden already did win an election against the fascists in 2020. And every day since then, the situation has only gotten more dire. Here on this show, we are dedicated to exposing and analyzing the fascist menace, not because that's the other team, not because we want to go back to some status quo that was never good to begin with, not because the Republicans are some cartoonish boogeyman, and not just because, in my opinion, this fascism exposes the utter deprivation of the whole capitalist imperialist system that would put fascism forward as an option. No, we do this because this is real. This is the road we're on, and it's what we actually face. And if we want to change course, it's up to us. The hundreds of millions in this country and the billions around the world. Not one fucking guy, not one party, definitely not anybody who's telling you to sit back, focus on yourself, and wait for one day in November to close a curtain and check a box. So if you're here for that kind of speculation, you might just want to stop listening. But the conversation itself is worth commenting on. It's quite remarkable to see a number of Biden's influential supporters and some of his Democrat detractors both making the claim that Biden's approach to foreign policy is where he shines, that it's where he comes alive. I think that there was a really telling exchange between a reporter, Saeed Arakat, and Biden's State Department spokesperson, Matthew Miller. Arakat asked for comment on the Lancet report that projected a death toll of at least 186,000 resulting from Israel's actions in Gaza since October. Miller has been roundly blasted for smirking during his answer, but even more chilling was the logic behind his words. He said that whatever estimate you go by, civilian casualties are way too high. Regarding a genocide that could not happen without the U.S.'s active support, for which this government is providing the bombs. Miller said that, quote, "This has been a human tragedy for some time," end quote. And he ended there. This, I believe, accurately represents the difference between Biden and Trump's foreign policy, where Trump wants everyone to know that he is both the victim and the aggressor. Biden and his spokespeople paint a U.S. foreign policy as a force of nature, quote unquote, a human tragedy. This difference in foreign policy is perhaps where we can see most clearly that their interests are not our interests. Biden and the ruling class forces backing him are in fact fighting against the threat of a fascist USA on some level. But this is why. This is what they're fighting for, to maintain the stability and status quo of empire. Not only is this morally reprehensible, but it also means that they can't fight fascism the way it needs to be fought, through unleashing all the tens of millions who fear Trump and everything he stands for. They can't and they won't do that. They continue to do everything in their power to undermine that for fear of losing their own grip on power. Meanwhile, last week on the show, we talked about how the head of the Heritage Foundation went on to Steve Bannon's show to tell the world that we are in the midst of a second American Revolution, a revolution that will be bloodless if the left allows it to be. For several months now, we have been exposing both the content and importance of the thoroughly fascist Project 2025, helmed by the Heritage Foundation and involving an unprecedented coalition of dozens of leading quote-unquote right-wing and quote-unquote conservative think tanks and policy institutes, alongside former Trump staffers. This week, the Washington Post reported that the Heritage Foundation is leading war games to strategize on how they will steal or overthrow or nullify the election if Trump is declared the loser. The Washington Post quoted Mike Howell, executive director of Heritage's Oversight Project, saying, quote, "As things stand right now, there's a 0% chance of a free and fair election. I'm formally accusing the Biden administration of creating the conditions that most reasonable policymakers and officials cannot in good conscience certify an election," end quote. They provided no evidence for their claims. This is a serious and acute threat, exponentially greater than anything cooked up by Roger Stone and some Proud Boys on January 6th. With so many people legitimately questioning the capacity of the Democratic Party to contend at the polls, it might be time to consider their capacity to contend with a full-blown fascist insurgency. Imagine the potential carnage if the command of even one military base went along with the delusions that the election was being stolen by Joe Biden. How far would they take it? Would they acknowledge the chain of command? Would they report to Trump instead? What orders do you think he would give? Meanwhile, the coup continues as the Republic fascists are strengthening the foundations to subvert the election, working now in several states, including Nevada, to sue to restrict rules for voting by mail. In Georgia, the Republic fascists controlled Georgia State Election Board has advanced an effort that would basically give local election board members the ability to delay certification and even carry out their own investigations into the vote. Allegra Lawrence Hardy, an Atlanta attorney and the senior advisor and legal counsel for Georgia voting rights group Fair Fight, told Salon that, quote, the foundation for obstructing certification of election results is being laid here in Georgia, end quote. Going on to say, quote, we're seeing the national strategy take shape in Georgia and in battleground states like Arizona, Michigan, and Nevada, where there have been recent efforts by Republican elected officials to delay or refuse certification, end quote. The goal is to raise suspicion, to provide the groundwork to overturn the results if Trump loses, contesting policies now further chipping away at voting rights, particularly the rights of minority communities, whom these fascists do not think are people worthy of a vote. We will be sure to talk more about this effort in future episodes. Starting tomorrow, Monday, July 15th in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Trump's fascist coronation kicks off. The RNC will be, as many have noted, a 4-day fealty fest, a testament to the success of the completeness of their purge. Trump and the MAGA fascist movement has asserted total domination of the party that truly is without precedent, as is their transformation of the highest court in the most powerful country into a MAGA fascist beholden instrument and top legislating body. The RNC platform is, in substance, unadulterated white supremacy, xenophobia, Christian fascism, and style, all caps with bizarre punctuation, 100% Trump. This platform promises boundless Hitlerian cruelty towards immigrants, quote unquote, stopping the migrant invasion, carrying out the largest deportation in modern history. I also want to lift up some other promises, including their promise to, quote, cut federal funding for any school pushing critical race theory, radical gender ideology, and other inappropriate racial, sexual, or political content on our children, end quote. Note that's all in caps. Along with their promise to, again, all caps, quote, deport pro-Hamas radicals and make our college campuses safe and patriotic again, end quote. I trust listeners, you can see through the doublespeak and just how ominous this shit is. We'll offer analysis on next week's episode, so you'll want to tune in for sure. But we want to salute the coalition to march on the RNC and all those who will be out protesting Fascist Fest 2024. A link is in the show notes. Moving on to abortion and the ways in which voting rights are being restricted and that intersection. It's a fact that when abortion is on the ballot, abortion ballot initiatives win. So in state after state where Republic fascists hold power, they are attempting to do whatever it takes to block the success of ballot initiatives. In Arkansas, where a total abortion ban is in effect, abortion rights advocates collected 100,000 signatures to get abortion on the ballot. So what did their Secretary of State, John Thurston, do? He just refused to accept them, using what appears to be a bogus technicality to keep abortion banned. A few weeks back in Montana, abortion rights advocates collected and submitted more than enough signatures, 117,000, to move forward with a ballot initiative in November to protect abortion rights. So what did Montana Secretary of State Christy Jacobson's office do? They tossed signatures, claiming that the voters are quote-unquote inactive and therefore do not count. Abortion rights groups have sued over this. And in their latest "We have softened our stance on whether women are humans," Republic fascists blocked the Freedom to Travel for Healthcare Act because what's the point if they can't punish women and those that love them for traveling across state lines for a life-saving or life-affirming abortion? For more on this, see Jessica Valenti's Abortion Every Day Substack, linked in the show notes. With that, here is my interview with Aziza Ahmed. There is a lot of confusion over what the Supreme Court has decided this term regarding abortion rights. And even more broadly, there's confusion about the impact of Dobbs. For assistance in navigating these revolving outrages, I am glad to be speaking with Aziza Ahmed. Aziza is a law professor at Boston University, where she is the N. Neil Pike Scholar. She is also the co-founder and co-director of the program on reproductive justice at Boston University. Welcome, Aziza. So glad you're here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Let's start with what is the landscape right now for reproductive justice. It's really staggering, I think, and overwhelming to think about the monumental harm that's already been done in the 2 years since Dobbs came through. And still, I think the full effects of it have not yet been seen. And you're someone who closely follows and intervenes in the legal sphere. So I was hoping you could just talk to us a little bit about what you're seeing and the lives of human beings that this is impacting.
Yeah, absolutely. Dobbs was the case in the Supreme Court that overturned Roe versus Wade. And Roe versus Wade was the case that guaranteed women abortion access, especially early on in pregnancy. Ever since Roe was decided in 1973, there have been attacks on the decision. And one of the things I want to say as I talk about the post-Dobbs environment is that we actually saw a lot of these horrible things that are being applied to a much wider swath of women being applied much more narrowly to largely poor women before Dobbs. Poor women, women of color, Black women, Latino women, immigrants were being heavily surveilled already for their pregnancies, for their behavior during pregnancy, and sometimes being prosecuted for actions taken around pregnancy. For example, attempting to induce an abortion too late or drug use during pregnancy. And it was a horrible situation for those poor women before. One of the reasons I like to foreground that is that if you were paying attention to these race issues and these class issues, as Lani Guinier and Gerald Torres once said, if you pay attention to what's happening to poor people and to Black people or people of color in this country, then you can start to see the cracks and the fissures in the democratic system that we have. So when Dobbs came, it sort of took those same lessons that had already been learned and those tools that had already been used against pregnant people and applied them more generally to the broader population, now under a broader rubric of sort of fetal personhood and a sort of different set of agendas that have taken shape and form and gained so much power over the last 50 years. So as soon as Dobbs happened, states began to restrict abortion access, largely by saying that they were going to criminalize the provision of abortion services after a certain time. It might be 6 weeks, it might be 20 weeks, it might be whatever they were doing. At 15 weeks, they were basically moving the clock forward and making it so that it was necessarily impossible for women to, and people who are getting pregnant to access abortion. Because as people who understand reproductive health know, a 6-week abortion ban is basically a full abortion ban, because by the time you're 6 weeks pregnant, you're actually only 4 weeks pregnant. By the time you realize you're pregnant, 2 weeks have already gone by. So, it's really like a 2-week window where you're pregnant and you want to terminate the pregnancy. This has created a crisis situation, especially in states like Texas and states like Idaho and Iowa, places where people are needing abortion services and they're showing up to emergency rooms, or they're having troubles with their pregnancy, and abortion is the care that is needed for them. It's creating confusion and chaos in the clinical setting around what physicians are allowed to do, what they're not allowed to do. States have banned access to abortion pills, mifepristone and misoprostol. Mifepristone has been the drug that's been under attack because it's very heavily regulated by the Food and Drug Administration, and it's the drug that's being banned. And you don't necessarily need mifepristone to induce a medication abortion. You can do a misoprostol-only abortion, but it is a better procedure. The standard of care is both drugs, the misoprostol and the mifepristone. So it's left a lot of people who can get pregnant and people who are pregnant in very difficult situations. People are having to travel out of state to get care. Doctors are afraid of being prosecuted. Physicians don't know when they're allowed to intervene. I'll just say something about that last point that I should probably clarify, which is that one of the issues around when physicians can intervene has to do with the fact that in many of these abortion bans or early abortion states where they put in early in gestation abortion restrictions, they basically have carved out exceptions for the life of the pregnant person. And the problem is that if you go into a hospital, it's very difficult to ascertain for the physician sometimes when your life is actually at stake versus, let's say, an organ, which the courts, the conservative movement seems completely fine with people losing their uteruses, fertility, all of that. It's life. So how do you know? Well, if you're a general counsel at a hospital, in order to prevent yourself from getting sued, the advice you're going to be giving to the physicians who are calling you and saying, I've got this patient who really needs a medical intervention. What should I do? Can I do this abortion? Is going to wait till this patient is on her deathbed before intervening. That's the best way to ensure that we're actually using the life exception as opposed to a health exception. This is putting women in precarious positions, all people who can be pregnant in precarious positions. And so we're just watching this nightmare take place and hoping that the leadership in this country, especially the conservative leadership in this country, will come to their senses around the fact that people don't want their wives and their mothers and the people that they care about in their life dying in hospitals over a procedure that's easy to do and sometimes necessary and something that should be accessible and could be easily accessible if it was legal.
Yeah, I think it's beyond tragedy, the fact that whether we live or die or are healthy or not, so much power is in the hands of those who see this as punishment and justifiable punishment. I think that that's a very dangerous place to be in.
It's extremely dangerous. And I think one of the most startling things for me, I sometimes work in the international context. I'm in conversation with people from other jurisdictions around the world where they've moved towards liberalizing abortion access. One of the things that you'll hear from activists and advocates in Mexico City or in Ireland or, places that have recently liberalized their abortion laws is that the stories of women and young girls suffering really moved politicians, even anti-choice politicians, and legislators, lawmakers. They would hear the stories and say, this shouldn't be happening to the women and girls in our country or in our city. And it doesn't seem to have any effects. It's really kind of shocking to see how these horror stories are emerging in all these different states. And it doesn't seem to move the needle at all. And I think it's because of what you said, that it's sort of punishment for bad behavior, or it's just the privileging of a fetal life over the life of the person carrying the pregnancy of the woman. And it's a choice that's being made to privilege a fetal life over a pregnant person's life, even in situations where that fetus has no chance of living outside the uterus. We're in a very disturbing moment.
Agree. Moving to this term's Supreme Court decisions in relation to abortion, I was thinking that we could first talk about the mifepristone case. The Supreme Court rejected a totally unhinged lower court ruling simply on the fact that the Christian fascist group bringing the lawsuit were not harmed in any way and have zero possibility of being harmed by the availability of mifepristone. This, for those listening, is the foundation of civil law. There's no harm, there's no standing to sue. It's honestly horrifying that the case got this far, showing just how thoroughly unmoored the Trump-backed judiciary is today. And I was hoping that you could talk a little bit more about what we need to understand about this ruling and the future of access to abortion medication.
So the case began, as you said, by essentially an organization that was founded to bring the case and a group of physicians and doctors who are anti-choice. And the claim that they made was that in theory, hypothetically, they might have to see more women in the emergency room setting or in an emergency setting because mifepristone is inherently unsafe. And the safety claim was wrapped up in the idea that the Food and Drug Administration, when they basically increased access to mifepristone by loosening the regulatory environment around it for example, during the pandemic, when people needed abortions and they couldn't go to the in-person clinics because it was actually dangerous. At that time, we were very worried about COVID. Constantly, a lot of people were dying of COVID. Should you send a woman into a clinic to get an abortion? And abortion, of course, became immediately a heated debate around whether or not it was an essential service to begin with. It was clear that what needed to happen was that medication abortion, which is mifepristone, which is a very safe drug and has been used for decades and decades, ought to be made available to women without having to basically go into the clinic first. The physicians could provide assessments over the phone of the type of pregnancy that the person was carrying, make sure it wasn't too far along in the pregnancy, basically check for the symptoms that would indicate an ectopic pregnancy, and safely prescribe the medication. The regulations were sort of adapting to the time, new safety data that was coming out, new information, the context in which we were operating and doing clinical practice at the time. And this group, AHM, the Alliance for Hippocratic Medicine, was basically arguing that the shifts in the FDA regulations were not based on good evidence, that the FDA wasn't acting essentially in a way that they should have. Now, the litigation is worrying because it suggests, if it had been completely successful, that the Food and Drug Administration, which is our nation's authority on regulating food and drugs, the decisions they're making at the FDA could basically be overturned by any set of plaintiffs who have a problem with or have an issue with the way the FDA ought to be approving drugs and thinking through drugs. And at the moment, the FDA is very rigorous. So we have the idea that the FDA is doing a good job. And, it's worth saying, too, of course, that mifepristone, when it was first approved back in 2000 as RU486 by the FDA, even then, the FDA put it under a regulatory framework that was too heavy-handed for the drug. And the drug had already been used for many, many years in Europe, and it was understood to be a safe drug. And even then, when the FDA put it under those harsher regulations, it was seen to be sort of in response to some of the conservative pressure. That the idea is that maybe the FDA was responding to some of that conservative pressure about not approving the drug to begin with. And ever since then, conservatives have been sort of agitating around mifepristone. Once the organization was formed, they brought the case specifically before a judge that would be sympathetic to their claim. And that judge sort of held that they had standing and that the case could move forward. The case moved forward to the Fifth Circuit. The Fifth Circuit is notoriously a conservative circuit. They, of course, did well at the Fifth Circuit as well. And then they moved on to the Supreme Court. Now, the Supreme Court held essentially that the physicians basically didn't have standing. And it was kind of obvious that they were going to decide that because at the oral arguments, the judges did express a lot of skepticism around whether or not the organization had standing to begin with. It was seen as a sort of win for the progressives. But the reality is that once another group is identified that can more closely make the link to, let's say, their experience of medication abortion, or the physicians that can make a stronger link to people who have actually treated women who have come in needing emergency care after a medication abortion. I think it would be hard to identify those physicians because it's such a rare instance to begin with. But once those folks are lined up, then they would have a much stronger claim towards standing. And then it opens the door to the opportunity to actually review whether or not the FDA should essentially roll back the regulations that are in place and put the stricter regulations in place, or whether they should actually leave the regulations as they are. Once that comes up, once standing is established and the door is open to reviewing what the FDA has done, we have another sort of scary set of questions to ask, which are around who should really have the authority to regulate drugs in America. Is it the Supreme Court or is it the FDA? We want it to be the FDA. We want to have a really strong regulatory body that understands how to do drug regulation and can do drug regulation and has long-term experts there who've been reviewing many drugs, and we want them to be able to do their job well. We don't want to be in a situation where the Supreme Court is just sort of attacking the FDA. Now, all of this has to be viewed in a bigger context, and that bigger context is that the Supreme Court, conservatives for a long time have been gunning to undermine the administrative state. The administrative state is sort of understood to be this large group of experts sort of acting in this undemocratic way. Who are they really accountable to? So the administrative agency has been a long-time target for conservatives. What we're seeing is, and what we're trying to figure out is how much the FDA is going to figure into this politics as it's sort of moving forward. And, we could ask ourselves, will the agencies that are more oriented around science, like the FDA and EPA, be somehow removed from these attacks on the administrative state? I'm not sure the future bodes well for that. I'm not sure that the court is too worried about whether or not they're a science-based agency or not, because, for example, the EPA has been at the crux of many of the attacks on the administrative state. So we're going to have to watch and see how it plays out, how the court is going to understand the FDA's authority and how they're going to understand the changes in the regulations over time that the FDA engaged in to make medication abortion more accessible. If Biden wins the next election, I think medication abortion will exist as a baseline, and you will be able to access medication abortion easily in blue states with liberal abortion access. You can get abortion medication mailed to you via organizations that you can access through places like Plan C and Plant C, organizations that are willing to essentially mail abortion medication to locations that people who are pregnant that need it can access it. So you'll be able to access it through the mail. If Trump wins the election, then I think it's very likely that a lot of what's happening at the FDA will be meddled with by the new administration. It's possible that they will go ahead and roll back to, let's say, the 2000 approval of medication abortion that had it under the strictest regulatory framework, which will limit access in many cases. And it's also possible that the administration will read a law, the Comstock Act, to basically say that you can't mail medication abortion. And that is going to severely undermine access because, of course, medication abortion isn't manufactured in every state in the United States. So it has to arrive at a facility, it has to arrive at a hospital, it has to arrive in clinics and in people's homes. That would be a really bad situation, which would essentially undermine the ability of most people to access medication abortion. Surgical abortion would still remain an option in blue states and in states, with some window for abortion care. But a medication abortion, which makes up the majority of abortions today, would not be available for most people.
So moving from the mifepristone case to the EMTALA case, before we talk about what was decided and what both the justices' questions reveal and what the majority ruling reveals, can you just briefly remind listeners what the case is about, what EMTALA is?
EMTALA is a law that was passed in the 80s, and it was passed because hospitals were engaged in patient dumping. People were showing up at the emergency room, and they weren't helping them. They were just putting them out on the street. EMTALA was a reaction to that and basically said that if states are getting Medicare funding and they have emergency rooms, that they have to provide stabilizing care. So they have to stabilize the patient before the patient can be transferred, etc. So the law was supposed to stop something horrific that was already happening, that people were being dumped. In the context of the case, Idaho passed a law that basically said that physicians can't perform abortions except to save the life of a woman. And EMTALA says that you have to provide stabilizing care. That created a conflict in the laws because essentially Idaho was saying, no, not until the patient's about to die, but stabilization could come much before that. And so the question is, do you ever perform those abortions in advance of a patient arriving on their deathbed, essentially arriving close to death? And Idaho was basically saying, no, you don't. And the federal government was saying, yes, you do. Essentially, the case went to the Supreme Court to try to understand whether or not federal law governs in these instances where states have passed these laws that basically don't allow physicians to comply with EMTALA. The disposition of the case was basically that the court took it without realizing that they shouldn't have taken it. And they basically held that for the time being, the Idaho physician should be following EMTALA, which will allow physicians then to do the interventions that are necessary. But once again, like the FDA case, this could just arrive before the Supreme Court again. There's a pending case at the Fifth Circuit out of Texas in which they basically said the Texas law is what governs, not EMTALA. So the court could soon have another opportunity to revisit the substantive question about whether or not preemption dictates that EMTALA be applied. After Dobbs, Health and Human Services had basically put out a advisory guidance that said, essentially, you have to follow EMTALA and you have to provide abortions if that's what's necessary for the stabilizing care. So again, we're kind of in a wait and see situation here where in the short run, the outcome was good. But in the long run, are we going to have the court essentially say that the supremacy clause doesn't apply here, or that actually you don't have to follow EMTALA? Or in Alito's version of this, he seemed to want to even read the text of EMTALA differently, because there is language of unborn child in EMTALA. And there's a footnote in, I believe it's Kagan's opinion, that basically says that unborn child language was there because there was this idea that pregnant women ought to be essentially getting all the care that they needed because they were pregnant. And Alito read that as sort of the unborn child is being put forward as its own patient, essentially. The problem is that there can be a conflict in the context of maternal fetal health, or even if there is no real conflict, but there's a perceived conflict if you understand the fetus to be a person. The question becomes, well, do you intervene and how do you intervene? So Alito's reading of EMTALA itself is very conservative, whereas the other justices were basically willing to say either the supremacy clause ought to rule here. Basically, EMTALA should be what governs. And even Barrett was willing to say that we have these conscience protections that basically allow people to be exempted, which to me suggested that she was saying that basically we ought to be providing the stabilizing care and just recognize that doctors have an out. Like, they don't have to do things that make them uncomfortable. But again, we're in a holding pattern. And I think one of the dynamics that Dobbs set up was that when the court basically said, hey, this isn't a question for the court, this is a moral question, this is a religious question, this is a question for people, and who's best to represent the views of the people? It's the states. These questions ought to be dealt with at the state level. They actually empowered themselves so much more, because now every single question is coming right back to the Supreme Court. We're hearing abortion case after abortion case after abortion case. And so ironically, they've made themselves the center of this litigation, even as they're disclaiming that, even as they're saying, actually, we're giving all these questions to the states. So we're going to have to wait and see how substantively the issue gets decided at the end of this long process of litigation and as these cases keep arising.
Thank you for walking us through this confusing case. The bottom line, I think, is that I feel like not enough people grasp. They said nothing about the merits of this case. They said nothing about it. So it goes back to these courts where they really don't care about the lives of women. And while it's an important narrow win for the people of Idaho whose lives are in jeopardy, it says nothing about the people of Texas or in the, I think, 6 other states who have laws that violate EMTALA. And it's partially the media that has made both these cases as these epic wins, because people want to be placated, I feel like. People want to be told that it's going to be all right. And I'm not saying it's not going to be all right, but things are not looking great.
I don't think things are looking great either. And I think we do have to acknowledge that there are a set of rules that allow physicians to exempt themselves from abortion care and conscience protections, et cetera. And so there is a frustrating thing happening where physicians are both making the claim that they have to do these things they don't believe in the context of mifepristone, or that they want to do the things and they're not being allowed to. But in the first case where they're saying like, oh, I'm going to be forced to do this, like, it's not true. So, but to have standing, they have to make that claim, but they could have exempted themselves. And then they're kind of saying, oh, but in the emergency context, we don't really have the option of backing out necessarily. There's a lot of bad faith arguments happening right now, and it's scary.
You alluded to this earlier in your response to, I think, the second question, but it's a frightening but a very real prospect that Trump could reseize power. He could be back in the White House. I'm wondering, with Chevron deference demolished, Project 2025, the blueprints for future erosion of abortion rights planted in majority rulings, what do you see as like the potential impact or the potential of further restrictions to reproductive rights?
I think the absolute worst case scenario is that we have no more abortion access in the United States, either because a federal law is passed or because mailing mifepristone is banned, because somehow the internal workings of the FDA are interfered with enough by the administration that they roll back the management of mifepristone. I think there is a very scary future that we could imagine, a future in which there is almost a full restriction on abortion access.
Thank you so much for taking the time to share your expertise and perspective with us. If people want to read more from you, connect more with your work, where do you want to direct them to?
You could go to my website at Boston University, and on that page, there's a link to various articles I've written on this topic.
Thanks so much, Aziza. As a refresher, not all of our guest comments necessarily reflect all of our views. This has come up recently with some emails I got, some DMs I got, and so I just want to put that out. We value our guest contributions, otherwise we would not broadcast them, and I feel disagreements can be valuable. So simply put, I do not think we can vote this fascism away, and we'll continue to have conversations about that on the show. Next, here's my conversation with Wajahat Ali. I'm here with Wajahat Ali. If you listen to the show, you know him. You listen to him on Democracy-ish, the podcast he co-hosts, might have read his book, Go Back to Where You Came From, or have seen him on an episode of The Nerd Avengers over on Mary Trump's YouTube channel, or maybe even seen him on MSNBC. You've likely read his work in the Daily Beast or already subscribe to his new Substack, The Left Hook, and follow him on the socials at Wajahat Ali. And of course, links to all those are in the show notes. There is so much to talk about. Thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, I mean, it's a slow news week as we record this the day before we celebrate our Independence Day, which, if you recall, Sam, what I learned was the founding fathers, quote unquote, fought against an imperial British monarchy because they wanted independence for this young country called the United States of America so they could elect their own king, but without a British accent. I think that's why those Americans fought the American Revolution, right, Sam? Because we wanted a king, but our own king, an American king.
Yeah, an American king who goes to McDonald's. That's what we wanted.
He eats rubber steak with ketchup, an aristocrat, very white, born into wealth like themselves, but unlike them, doesn't really read books, not very educated or worldly. And unlike them, has promised to be a dictator for a day. And unlike them, twice impeached and held liable for rape and fraud and defamation. And unlike them, a jury of our peers convicted him of 34 out of 34 counts for falsifying business records to pay hush money to an adult film star before he was elected. And if people found out that news before he was elected, he wouldn't have gotten elected. But other than that, just like the founding fathers, is Donald Trump, who, as we're recording this, now has been given carte blanche by his Supreme Court to be basically a dictator, not just for a day, Sam, but forever. Because now, according to the right-wing, rogue, corrupt, conservative justices on the Supreme Court, who have fidelity to white Christian nationalism and right-wing sugar daddy billionaires, a president can potentially kill you or me and get absolute immunity if it is done within an official act. So no checks and balances, because, you know, the founding fathers didn't care about that. No separation of powers, no limits on the executive. Nope. George Washington could just take his musket and shoot Thomas Jefferson in the gut over like a disagreement on chess, and it would have been fine. It would have been fine. Here we are.
Yeah. So again, nothing to talk about. For just a few days after the slew of Supreme Court rulings, including the ruling that the president of the U.S. is a king, as you just said, and about a week after the debate, but one of these overriding, or at least should be in most people's minds, and one that's shaping all discourse for better or for worse, mainly for worse, is the genocide that Israel is waging on Gaza, which has now gone on for over 9 months, which Israel has held captive 2.2 million people in the Gaza Strip, really in a death grip, subjecting the whole population to massive bombing and shelling. At least 38,000 people have been killed, including at least 15,000 children. along with 10,000 missing or presumed dead. More health workers in the last 9 months have been killed in little tiny Gaza than all health workers killed in all conflicts globally between 2021 and 2022 combined. I wanted to start there, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course. And it all coincides because as of today's recording, we just found out that Israel has announced its most massive expansion of settlements in the West Bank. So everyone has been naturally occupied with Gaza. But while this horror show, this genocide has been happening in Gaza, in the West Bank, you have had more than 500 Palestinians killed in the past 8 months. You've had settlers become more extreme and more violent, kill Palestinians, injure Palestinians without any accountability whatsoever. Ben-Gvir, who is the national security minister of the present Israel government, who, by the way, folks, was convicted of inciting terrorism against Palestinians by his own government. He's the national security minister of this increasingly, I think we can use the word, fascist government run by Benjamin Netanyahu, who has openly expressed genocidal comments along with his entire cabinet, who, by the way, the ICC prosecutor said, along with Hamas leaders, is guilty of war crimes. This man, Sam, in July, is going to come to the United States of America after receiving a bipartisan invite to address U.S. Congress. And that letter, for folks who don't know, was signed by both Democratic and Republican leaders. Mike Johnson, I believe McConnell, Hakeem Jeffries, and Schumer. And this is after the ICC ruling. If we talk about fascism, we see America just spiraling towards fascism. You see Israel spiraling towards fascism. And I want to remind folks how this is all connected is that Europe, folks, had elections. In Europe, I know people aren't paying attention because there's so much, but we should keep that in focus. And I just want to just connect the dots for folks. Right-wing parties, and I'm talking about extreme right-wing, xenophobic, Islamophobic parties who want an ethno-nationalist state for white Christians, have won across the board.
We recorded this after the EU elections, but before the most recent elections in France and England.
Le Pen's party in France, Geert Wilders' party made gains in Netherlands. You already have Orban in Hungary, whom Steve Bannon said is Trump and before Trump. You had Meloni in Italy, lipstick fascism, with her pastel colors, who hosted the G7, folks, the normalization of fascism. You know, the person who, by the way, was part of the Mussolini Youth Party, that Meloni. And while this was happening in the past 2 weeks, Israel, according to Haaretz and other articles, Israeli leaders are like, oh, this is good for Israel. So you have to sit there and ask yourself, Sam, why is the rise of anti-Semitic, xenophobic, Islamophobic right-wing parties in Europe good for the Israeli government? And the answer is because they see an ally in themselves. Oh, no rule of law, no accountability. We can give a middle finger to the United Nations. We could give a middle finger to the world. Oh, they respect us even though they hate us because we're an ethno-nationalist state. We hate Muslims and Arabs. They hate Muslims and Arabs. We'll be allies, just like Narendra Modi, Hindu fascist in India, is an ally with us. And by the way, Geert Wilders has been courted and feted by Israel for the past 20 years. He's gone to that country more than 24 times. And that Netanyahu, who has aligned himself with these people and white Christian nationalists in the United States of America, who are responsible for Project 2025, is coming to this country. And President Biden, you know, the sins of the past, right? I was thinking about this. President Biden gave a bear hug to Netanyahu. Me and you and other people have said, please look at the tea leaves. This man is poison. And because Biden, and this is, you know, I praise him when he deserves to be praised. I criticize him when he deserves to be criticized. I'll end my rant with this. I think when all is said and done, and this might be the end of the Biden administration, it might be the end of democracy in America. We can unpack that if Trump wins, but this will be a dark cloud hanging over his presidency, that the United States and Biden were complicit in an ongoing genocide and supported one of the most unpopular leaders in the world, who every single opportunity he had, Sam, mocked, ridiculed, and weakened President Biden, pissed down his throat. And despite that, still gave him a bear hug. And so right before Netanyahu is going to come and address U.S. Congress, what does he do? I'm going to expand settlements in direct violation of President Biden in the U.S. And what are we going to do, Sam? We're going to say, well, nobody's perfect. Sorry, I had to go on a rant. You teed me up.
No, it was important. And I think there's a couple things that you brought up that I just want to underscore. One, I think that you might have alluded to, but I think people really need to confront. Hamas doesn't have power in the West Bank.
Correct. It's the Palestinian Authority. They're not in control of the West Bank.
So any whataboutism, what about you shut the fuck up at this point? Also, this is what you're saying doesn't correspond to reality. This is what's happening because of U.S. support and would not happen without U.S. support. They would not be able to do what they're doing on the scale that they're doing it without the U.S. support. And so it's not this tangential question. Even if you could lose enough of your humanity to look at the suffering of our Palestinian siblings and not give a shit, you can't pretend that this is not happening with the direct support of our government, your government. And I think people have to confront that. And then you were bringing up an important point about the Christian Zionists that have taken this. And I think that people have to look at who these strange bedfellows are and where this ends up, because these are people who are not doing this for some
altruistic reason to help the Jews
or some like weird Jew fetish. That's not what this is. They believe that with Armageddon, which they're like welcoming, Jews will either convert to Christianity or be sent to burn in hell forever. So their support for Israel is not about love for Jews. It's about their end times mission. And I think that that is an important reminder.
No, it's very important. And I think you bring up 2 points that I'm glad you did. And real quick, working backwards, the largest Zionist group in America does not belong to Jewish group. It is Christians United for Israel, CUFI. It is headed by Pastor John Hagee from Texas, white evangelical Christian. That was the same pastor who, surprise, surprise, showed up in Jerusalem under the Trump administration when they moved the embassy to Jerusalem. And the reason why that's so contested is because East Jerusalem, which, by the way, is also occupied, we don't talk about East Jerusalem, was supposed to be the future capital of Palestine. So by moving the embassy to Jerusalem, what Trump said is, there goes your two states, without saying it. And who was there giving the prayer? Pastor Hagee. Who was Pastor Hagee's greatest ally in America? Netanyahu. Who gives a videotaped address each year at the CUFI conference? Netanyahu. Who is Netanyahu's base? White Christian nationalists and the right wing. And like you said, for those who don't follow Christian nationalism or the theology, is that they believe that one of the necessary steps for the end times, like you said, they welcome with open arms, they want the rapture, is that Jews have to control what Jews refer to as the Temple Mount or what Muslims refer to as Haram Sharif, basically Jerusalem. That Jews have to control Jerusalem as a necessary precondition for the second coming of Jesus. And I just want to add one thing, Sam. It isn't that, they'll either burn in hell or they'll convert. The first two groups that will die in mass, that will be killed when Jesus returns, according to them, are Jews and Muslims, because our peoples will be like, nah, we're good. And they're like, you didn't convert, you got to die. And so that's why they're aligned with fascism, because they don't care. This goes along with the Supreme Court, with Alito, with the leaked recording that Lauren Windsor did, right? Where he's openly saying there's two groups, they can't coexist, one side's going to win. They're Christian nationalists. And then there's Clarence Thomas, who is a black Christian nationalist, and Stephen from Django Unchained, who wants to revisit Brown versus Board of Education. And then the second point I think is very important that I always usually make it, I'm glad you said it, is that the whataboutism is Hamas, Hamas, Hamas. You know, every time you say Hamas, take a shot of alcohol, you'll be dead in 5 minutes. But for people who don't know, okay, Hamas, October 7th, Hamas. Maybe in your weird, perverse mental gymnastics, you can rationalize what's happened in the past 8 months. I can't, despite the terrible terrorist act of October 7th, where 1,400 people got killed. This is now July. What justifies nearly 40,000 people killed and man-made starvation? Please, I don't know. But anyway, suppose you say that. West Bank is not controlled by Hamas. It is controlled by the Palestinian Authority. What excuse is there for Israel building illegal settlements on the West Bank and expanding them? And each time I've gone on television, on Piers Morgan and others, every time I bring this point, Sam, the pro-Israeli Hasbara talking head has no counter. Even in America, they have no counter because oh shit. They're like, I'm like, suppose you really care about peace and you're saying no partner for peace. Okay, why is Israel expanding settlements? Why are they eating the pie? Why are they expanding the holes in the Swiss cheese, and what's left for Palestinians? Nothing. And then you realize, oh, it's because they don't want a Palestinian state. Oh, Netanyahu's now openly admitting it. Oh, they want it all. River to the sea. Oh, they're extremists. And I've gone there 3 times. I did a report on there. The settlers, they're kind of different. But basically the end goal is this all belongs to us. Some of them are like, okay, if it's a one state, I don't care if Palestinians are citizens, just we get all the land. And others are openly like, we're going to kick them out. And it's inevitable. And that, by the way, is ethnic cleansing, when you force a local population out and kick them out. And now you see the Israeli government openly saying, well, why doesn't Egypt take the people in Gaza or Jordan? And they're like, why should they? They're Palestinians. We are complicit with our taxpayer dollars in an ongoing genocide. Or if you don't like that G word, I think it's clear now it's a genocide, 9 months in. Genocidal implications, Sam. And you're absolutely right. The third point that you made is it's clear is that if Joe Biden picks up the phone today and says, I'm done, you will not get our support, you know what's going to happen? The war is going to end. And I give you one example, folks. In November, an Israeli official openly admitted that that temporary ceasefire, which, by the way, brought home 100 plus hostages, and since then, Israel's only been able to bring in 7 and kill 3 of them, by the way. That came as a result, as the Israeli official said, based on U.S. pressure. And he said, once your ally, your most powerful ally, tells you to do something, you have to do it. So imagine if Joe Biden called up and said, we will stop shipments. The war will end, Sam. But the calculation that Democrats have made is 4 months ahead of this election, if we appear weak and when we backtrack, then we lose donors, we'll lose Jewish support, and we'll open ourselves up to attacks from Republicans for being weak on Israel. And the pivot that I've offered, and I'll still offer, is if Biden and Democrats attacked Netanyahu and said, we're with Israel and with the Israeli people, but Netanyahu is a disease, we will not support Netanyahu. I think that will be the pivot that'll give them an escape to end the war and also help them bring back some voters. But they won't do that because Joe Biden is stuck in friggin' 1970s and he still has wet dreams about Golda Meir.
We could talk at length about what the Trump administration did vis-a-vis Israel, how they are promising so much worse for the Palestinian people. At the same time, I wonder what your perspective is on how this genocide and the U.S. role in it affects the larger anti-Trump, quote-unquote, coalition, if we can even call it that at this point. We could talk about the debate last week, but even before then, people have been saying they can't in good conscience line up behind Genocide Joe. And what do you think it says about this purely electoral strategy, both in terms of the moral compromises people are being told to make, e.g. supporting genocide, but also in terms of political expedience?
So let me respond with a quote from Kevin Roberts, who is the president of Heritage Foundation, an extremely influential conservative think tank that is overwhelmingly responsible for creating the Project 2025 blueprint, which I'm sure you've talked about on your podcast, which is like the James Bond villain plan for the second Trump presidency. Imagine the Bond villain. I love Bond movies. It's usually in the last act where the Bond villain goes, Mr. Bond, let me tell you my plan. And he monologues for 5 minutes. This is like in the first 10 minutes before the naked golden ladies dance in the song intro, where the Bond villain will just find James and say, hey, want to see my villainous plan? I have a slideshow. You have 5 minutes? So this is what the architect of that said. This is Kevin Roberts, and I'm going to quote him. He said this on Steve Bannon's show War Room. Steve Bannon couldn't host because he's in prison. So this is what he said in response to the Supreme Court ruling that made essentially the next president, Trump, into a dictator. Quote, and so I come full circle in this response. And I just want to encourage you with substance that we are in the process of the second American Revolution, which will remain bloodless if the left allows it to be, end quote. We are recording this on Wednesday, the day before July 4th, or Independence Day. This was on Tuesday. I preface my answer with that because I just want to remind people of the stakes. And I want to also empathize with people. I cannot tell my Palestinian friends who have lost family members, hold your nose and vote for Biden. Democracy is at stake. I mean, I could, but if they said, I can't, F him, F you, I'm like, I get it. If there's genocide and 40 of your family members have been killed and the world doesn't give a shit, do I really want to vote for the guy who's been complicit? Now, for the rest of us, people will say, Wajahat, well, how do you reconcile your articles and tweets and appearances, such as your conversation with Sam right now, where you say, despite all of that, which you have conceded, you're still saying, you sellout whore of a man, that we should vote for Biden or Harris? And I say yes, for these two reasons. Biden has been terrible on Palestine, and Trump will be even worse. How do we know? During the presidential debate, when asked if he supports a Palestinian state, do you know what Trump said? Remember that? We'll get into that later. Secondly, in that debate and the next day at a rally, Trump used Palestinian, literally the identity of millions of people, as a pejorative against Biden, and the next day as a pejorative against Schumer, saying he's no longer a Jew, he's a Palestinian. In addition to what he said in October is that he's going to bring back the Muslim ban and a litmus test for immigrants, which honestly, if you and me were immigrants, we wouldn't come to this country. And the fact that in Project 2025, he's going to deport illegally immigrants and create camps. And the fact that he is aligned with white Christian nationalists, as we said, who have an Armageddon type agenda. And he will give a carte blanche, as he said, and according to, fundraisers, to let them finish the job, quote unquote. And he's courting Miriam Adelson's $100+ million, and she wants the full annexation of West Bank. So as bad as it is, and it is bad, Sam, he will be even worse. And then number two, Timothy Snyder, I'm sure you probably talked to him or, know about him, studied fascism and wrote the book on tyranny, tweeted something alarming 2 days ago. He says, if Trump wins, it is the end of American democracy. And I agree with that.
Look, a lot of people voted in 2020 for precisely what you said. People saw what a Trump second term would mean, and they said, hell no. And they were so afraid of the fascist prospects that they voted. And they voted for Joe Biden. This is not round one. And so people expected and hoped, I think, that there was going to be some backstop, that this was going to give us time to prevent this from happening again. And people believed that the courts wouldn't do what the courts did. People believed that there wasn't this mass movement in this country, which is still a minority, but a very vocal, organized, loud minority. And now people are like, oh, shit.
I don't think they are yet, Sam. I don't think they are yet. I think they're still in it can't be that bad. The institutions will hold. I think they're still there.
Yeah, I'm not sure. And now I'm like, okay, we're dealing with everything that you laid out with the quote from Heritage. We're dealing with the fact that Trump said 3 times during the debate, he won't accept the election results if he loses, basically. I don't think people get the prospect that he is not going to go quietly into the night. Like, this is the moment they've been waiting for, and they're ready and poised in a way that they weren't last time.
They're all in. They're all in. Mask off moment.
Well, I want to thank you so much, Wajahat, for coming and talking with me, sharing your insight, your perspective.
I talk too much. I'm sorry. You got me passionate about these things. There's so much happening.
I want to just give you one last opportunity. If people probably already follow you, if they listen to the podcast, but if they don't, you have a new Substack. You have another podcast that you didn't have before, I think.
That's on a hiatus. I started a new Substack called thelefthhook.substack.com. After 2 years, I finally jumped in. The response has been great. I've kept it cheap as hell and also free if you have no money, but subscribe if you can. And we're going to grow it out. And I want it to be a part of this coalition. I think the right wing and the contrarians have dominated the space. There's more of us. And I feel like more of us are jumping in. We should take over, or at least create a big piece of the playground for us. And then I also have the Democracy-ish podcast. And you can also buy my book, Go Back to Where You Came From, and other helpful recommendations on how to become American.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Sam.
We have some recommended reading and listening this week. For more on Trump v. United States, after you listen to our episode from last week, of course, check out the special episode from the 5-4 podcast, which covers the fascist immunity decision and how this really previews what a second Trump term would be like. We didn't get to discuss NatCon 2024, so I recommend reading the 3 days worth of dispatches from Annika Brockschmidt and Ben Lober, which was published up over at Religion Dispatches. And one more recommendation, Inside Zitlag, the secret organization of wealthy Christians trying to sway the election and change the country. It's a serious investigative piece put together by Andy Kroll for ProPublica and Nick Sergi for Documented. It goes deep into the group's 2024 vision and exposes their goals for Christian theocracy. Links to all of those are in the show notes. Thanks for listening to Refuse Fascism. Want to help this show reach more people when it's needed most? Awesome. As people rightly agonize over the fascist threat, help grow the community we need by literally wearing Refuse Fascism across your chest by purchasing one or more of our Refuse Fascism t-shirts. When you buy the shirt, you are also helping produce and promote the show. See the show notes to get your shirt today. When it arrives, take a selfie or a pic of your crew all wearing your shirts and post on social media and tag Refuse Fascism to spread the word. If you want to take a step further, become a patron for as little as $2 a month at patreon.com/Refuse Fascism. It all makes a difference in producing and promoting this independent, all-volunteer weekly podcast. And patrons have a discount code for those shirts posted on the Patreon page. Thanks for your support. And if you can't give now, or if you did already are a patron, share the show with others. Rate and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen, or comment on our socials or YouTube. It makes a difference and is so appreciated. Got thoughts or questions off this episode? We want to hear them. Ideas for topics or guests? Yes, please send them to us. Have a skill you think could help? We want to know all about it. Reach us on the socials at Refuse Fascism, just about all the places. And over on the YouTubes, you can reply with a comment. Find us at Refuse_Fascism. And if YouTube's your thing, be sure to hit that subscribe button. You can also, as always, leave us a voicemail. See the show notes for the button. Or if you want to reach me, you can find me at Twitter at Sam B. Goldman. Drop me a line at SamanthaGoldman@refusefascism.org, or over on the TikToks at Sam Goldman RF. Thanks to Mark Tinkelman, Richie Marini, and Lena Thorne for helping produce this episode. Thanks to incredible volunteers, we have transcripts available for each show. So be sure to visit refusefascism.org and sign up to get them in your inbox. Until next Sunday, in the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America.